All right, good afternoon. Welcome to our lunch study break. It is Wednesday, August 11th, 2021. And we are in the month of Elul. And for the month of Elul, in preparation for our high holidays, what we are going to be doing, what I am going to be spending every Wednesday lunchtime, learning about our Rabbi of blessed memory, Alan Lew. So it's an interesting experience becoming a rabbi of a congregation that had such a legendary and well-known and really wonderful rabbi. I never had the privilege of knowing Rabbi Lew, but certainly many of my colleagues did. And I was, I think, like most rabbinical students around the country and young rabbis, well aware of his book, This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared, The Days of Awe, a Journal of Transformation. That was his, and I still say that was probably the most popular book written by a rabbi, at least amongst people who are interested in the month of Elul and the high holiday season, so far written in this century. And so what I want to do is, so I came here 3 years ago, and all of you shared with me wonderful stories about Rabbi Lew, about who he was, about his teaching. And I've been blessed and privileged to hear amazing stories from all of you. However, sometimes those stories and the beautiful memories that we have of him as a person, we can tend to think of that only in the past. And we could view Rabbi Lew's Torah as being stuck in a place in time. And what I'd like to do is, as we're approaching the 2nd century of this congregation, I'd like to take Rabbi Lew with us. I'd like Rabbi Lew's teachings to be alive, and I'd like to see how what he taught and gave to so many of you can be shared and come alive today in this very uncertain world. And I think we can all agree that what's happening in our world is totally real and we're all completely unprepared. So it applies today. All right, so what I'm going to do here over the next several weeks is I'm going to start slowly and broadly, so that my expectation is that you could be watching this either live with us right now or on the recording and not know who Rabbi Lew is. I have no assumption that anybody here is familiar with him. And so what I want to do is begin with a background from Rabbi Lew. And I'm sharing this because this is how I came to know Rabbi Lew. And this is how many people have come to know Rabbi Lew. And so let's begin here. We can see him, we'll hear his voice, and then we'll go and we'll learn more about who he was as a rabbi and the Torah that he has to share with us. All right, so this is from September 15th, 2006. Just do me a favor, just nod if you can hear.
Deep in the heart of the Ventana wilderness south of San Francisco, Rabbi Alan Lew leads Jewish practitioners in Buddhist meditation.
Always return to the breath and listen as the heart discloses itself.
This group is at Tassajara, a Zen Buddhist monastery, for a week-long retreat to prepare for the Jewish high holidays. Following meditation, they participate in a traditional Jewish prayer service. Rabbi Lew, who is guiding the retreat, says that meditation opens one to a deeper and more subtle kind of spiritual experience and enhances traditional Jewish practice.
What really makes Jewish prayer powerful is something inexpressible. And meditation really sensitizes you to the inexpressible. Many people may walk into a Jewish prayer service for the first time and feel really turned off because they're focusing on the language, which they don't understand. They're focusing on the rituals, which they also don't understand. But if they walk in after an hour of meditation, they're focused on those very subtle kinds of feelings that are being expressed underneath the language and underneath the rituals. And that's really the essence of the prayer service.
Lew was born in a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn in 1943 and grew up in a secular Jewish household. Though he remembers praying as a child, he wasn't aware of the spiritual value of Judaism. In the 1960s, he traveled to California to pursue his spiritual path, experimenting with different Asian practices and eventually discovering Zen Buddhism. Lew spent the next 10 years engaged in rigorous Zen practice, including retreats here at Tassajara, which he says led him back to his Jewish roots.
Zen meditation has this very annoying habit of forcing you to look at those parts of your life that you've been unwilling or unable to look at. And for me, Judaism was certainly one of those.
It was while sewing the breastplate for his robe as part of ordination to become a Zen monk that Lew realized how deeply Jewish he was.
I was trying to sew this breastplate, and with each stitch, you're supposed to say, I take refuge in the Buddha, but I found that I just couldn't do it. After 10 years of the layers of my spirituality peeling away like an onion, I was finding that there was something irredeemably Jewish at the core.
Lew went on to become a rabbi in the conservative branch of Judaism and has spent the last 20 years as rabbi of several congregations. Last year, he retired to focus on teaching meditation in a Jewish context. He says meditation plays a particularly important role in preparing for the journey of transformation called teshuvah at the heart of the high holidays.
It's a turning inward. It's a turning towards awareness, a turning away from alienation and estrangement from ourselves and from others and from God, and towards reconciliation on all these levels. And that's what meditation does. Meditation makes us more aware. Meditation helps us turn towards the reality of our lives. Meditation helps show us the truth of our lives, and it also helps bring us together with others. And it also gives us a sense of the presence of the transcendent. So it fits almost perfectly into all the major concerns that we're engaged with at this time of year.
Lew is invited to synagogues around the country to help congregations experience the power of meditation to deepen their Jewish practice, especially during the period of contemplation leading up to the high holidays.
This tshuva business, it's right there. It's that pain that's sitting right on the top of your heart. That's what you need to do tshuva about it. But the question is, how do you look at the heart? We sneak up behind it. We focus on the breath, we focus on the body, and while we are focusing on these things, the heart discloses itself to us in the form of these thoughts which carry our awareness away. Patterns will form, and those are precisely the things that we need to make tshuva about. There's that great saying in the Torah, you should not hold a grudge.
In his retreats, Lew encourages participants to embark on the journey from alienation and estrangement to reconciliation and atonement, a journey that involves the hard work of forgiveness.
When we become aware of our own pain, we also become more sensitive to the pain of others. That's when real forgiveness can take place. Without that, forgiveness is kind of an empty gesture.
One of the most fundamental transformations people seek during the holidays, Lew says, is to experience themselves not as distinct and separate from others, but as part of something larger, as part of a single spiritual entity.
One of the most powerful potentials of these kinds of practice is that they bring us into real connection with each other. We go out in the street and there's somebody out on the street and we feel connected to them. And if they're a homeless person or if there's someone who has no food, then we experience their suffering to be our own suffering.
The connection Lew felt with others through meditation, combined with the Jewish emphasis on social justice, led to a change in his own life.
When we see the homeless on the streets of our city, failing and vulnerable, we see our own failure and our own vulnerability, and we see our own guilt for failing to care for them.
Lew became more actively engaged in social concerns, speaking out on behalf of the homeless and against capital punishment. Recently, he and several other local clergy were arrested and issued citations during a rally of San Francisco hotel workers fighting to keep their pay and benefits.
I am engaged, and I didn't used to be. I spent many, many years thinking that the only thing I could do to save the world was to work on my own considerable craziness. But this combination of the imperative for social justice and this real experience of connection really makes it almost impossible not to do this kind of work.
Lew says the journey of transformation that is the focus for Jews at this time of year is like the journey of everyone's life.
Transformation goes on all the time. We are transforming beings. Transformation is a divine imperative. It's always introduced that way in the Torah, not as something we undergo as a kind of leisure activity, which is, I think, how many in this country regard spiritual activity, something we do on weekends, but really essential to our meaning as human beings.
And transformation is important not only for the followers of Judaism, he says, but for the tradition itself.
I think if Judaism is to survive as something other than a mere ethnicity, it needs to recapture its inner sense. And that's what meditation brings to this. It really helps to show us the inner meaning, the essence of all these practices, something that really goes to the core of our existence, something that touches us at the root of our soul will endure.
For Religion and Ethics News Weekly, this is Kate Olson in San Francisco.
So that's really lovely. A lovely way for us to see Rabbi Lew and begin to understand who he was, what he meant to this community, and what he can continue to mean for all of us in this world. I admit to feeling a little sadness when watching that. So I just want to acknowledge that. I know I'm not going to focus in on the sadness. We're going to learn his Torah and take it with us into this next century of our community. But I just want to say how sad I did feel watching that, and how be nice to have him around these days. And I definitely felt that, and his presence came through very palpably. So that is a little bit about Rabbi Lew. He unfortunately passed away not long after that, only about 18 months after that PBS hit, unfortunately. And so what Rabbi Lew was talking about here, and why it resonates with me, is because it is a real felt experience of Jewish ritual and Jewish understanding, as opposed to, you've heard me talk about Judaism that is done by rote, done without feeling, where we say these words, but we don't believe the words, where we are participating in a ritual, but we don't think that that ritual has existential meaning. And a lot of the Judaism I grew up with in the 80s and the 90s was the story I have always told. When I started at the rabbinical school in the summer of 2002, I was learning Talmud with Rabbi Morris Shapiro of blessed memory. And I said, why do it after what you saw in the Holocaust? He was a Holocaust survivor, moved to this country, and for 55 years lived as a rabbi. I said, why do it? Why live your life 55 years after what you witnessed in the Shoah? And he says, Judaism rests on three things: God, Torah, and Israel. He said, I love Torah, I love books, I love the people of Israel. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. And that was the Judaism that I grew up with in the 70s and the 80s, and a lot of my peers grew up with, which was support the state of Israel, study and get good grades. This God stuff is nourishkeit. We don't really believe in it anyway. Don't harp on it too much. And as a result of that, a lot of my peers, and not just my peers, but I think your peers and peers for those in the generation below me, have found alternative means to experience that third sense of the stool, that sense of God. They sought out music, retreat centers, Buddhism, Burning Man, ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru, because there was this third spiritual element that they were not finding addressed in Jewish settings. And what Rabbi Lew really beautifully spoke to there is he's trying to come up with this connection, that beautiful image of him with the breastplate, sort of stitching the breastplate, knowing that he just can't do it because there is something nagging at him, and that's being a Jew. And having to ultimately come back to his Jewish identity and to explore that. And then finding that all of this, well, maybe not all of this, I don't want to overstate Rabbi Lew, but finding that so much of what meditation practice and the stuff that he had studied previously, as he just said, fit perfectly into the central themes of Judaism, and in particular, the central themes of this month of Elul. So the next thing I want to do as a little intro, that was my little introduction to Rabbi Lew. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to go into taking a look from a text of his on his book on this week's Torah portion, and then how can we apply Rabbi Lew's practice and Rabbi Lew's teachings in the next coming month. So I just want to pause for a second and take any questions. Ben.
Yeah, thanks. I'd never seen that before. It's really beautiful. And especially since I never knew Rabbi Lew, it's always nice to see him. So I was really struck by something that he said sort of earlier on in the program about his, how he uses meditation within a Jewish prayer context, and it reminded me a lot of the sort of concept of anchoring. It's a sort of psychological concept, right? That you experience things differently when you are anchored or primed in a certain way. And he's clearly using meditation as a way of anchoring people's experience of Jewish prayer. And I think a lot of times, right, people are anchored by their previous bad experiences of Jewish prayer, right? When they walk into a service.
Yes.
And I think we often try to either strip stuff away from that experience, right, to avoid that, or replace that experience with something else that we feel won't trigger people in the same way. But I think Rabbi Lew has really another interesting approach, is that no, you don't have to strip stuff away. You don't have to replace it. You just have to introduce something maybe before it to anchor people differently so they can have the same experience in a different way.
It's beautiful. And this will come through as we unfold Rabbi Lew over the coming weeks. We'll go into sort of the depth of what he was teaching, but it's exactly his commitment to halakha and to Judaism and to the rigidity of that. He was not seeking to replace, just as you described, Judaism with Buddhism. He was seeking to anchor the Judaism in a practice that would allow people to come in, as opposed to anchoring in a previous practice that might trigger them and force them to run away. I applied a similar method to less success when I took high holidays and I put them in a concert venue and I brought musicians. We read the liturgy, but the venue was different. It was a concert venue. It was a bowling alley. We had all of the accoutrements of an experience, of a festival that they would enjoy coming to and gather and have a communal experience and sing together. So I filtered that, and then I get the high holidays instead of trying to trigger them in an anchoring them in a positive experience to prime them, if you will, for actually being open to what the liturgy is teaching. Judah.
Yeah, I was just kind of taken aback that he let that interview run as is when she opened it and said, he's leading a bunch of Jews in Buddhist meditation. And I don't, he was very clear. I mean, he gave props to Buddhism, but we were Jews. It wasn't Buddhist meditation. We were Jews who were meditating. And indeed, I mean, it's not there's plenty of Boo Jews around. from Sylvia Boorstein to Jack Kornfield to probably even Norman Fisher, but we're not boo Jews. We're Jews who meditate. So I just that took me aback when she said he's leading Jews in a Buddhist meditation. I don't think that's,
no, I don't think, I think you're right. And I think the best of Judaism has always been to appropriate from the cultures around us, as Ben was talking about, like the Passover Seder was an appropriation of a Greek symposium. Like we have found different, a lot of our music is German 19th century music. Sadikat. That stuff is not quintessentially Jewish. It's appropriated from the culture around us so that people would enjoy singing the liturgy. And I think your point is he was not going to describe himself as a Jew boo. I think he is a Jew first. And I have noticed that issue comes up with Rabbi Lew throughout a lot of his career. There's that famous picture of him sitting with the gi and the talit as the Zen rabbi, which I think I've heard that he had some ambivalence towards that picture itself. But because this is, you're exactly right, this is Jewish, let's take a look. Let's take a look at some text here, which I think is going to be very relevant. So we are in the month of Elul, and I've been told I scroll too quickly. So I'm going to scroll slowly here so that everyone can follow along. And so this is from his book. This is real, and you are completely unprepared. This week's Torah portion is Parshat Shoftim. And we find Parshat Shoftim, as Rabbi Lew tells us, in the month of Elul. And so he highlights a particular section that I'd like to read, and then we can discuss what we can learn from it. So there are several very powerful suggestions later on in Parshat Shoftim as to precisely what it is we should be looking for during the month of Elul, as we turn towards the gates of the soul in preparation for Teshuvah. So now if you're new to Rabbi Lew or you're new to Congregation Beth Shalom, the month of Elul is the month leading up to Rosh Hashanah and to Yom Kippur, in which we will ask for atonement. The process of those 10 days are called the 10 days of Teshuvah. Teshuvah is translated as repentance, or a return to the people that maybe God created us to be. So that is the concept. And so we're preparing for this high holiday experience, and Shoftim, according to Rabbi Lew, can give us a little road mark about what we can do this week. I'm talking about what we can do this week right now. What can we do this week? How can we apply Rabbi Lew? This is not, that's really what I want us to start thinking about in the future. So these suggestions come, oddly enough, in the laws of war that are enunciated towards the end of the Parsha. So before Israel goes off to war, the Torah tells us the officers of the army must address the people and tell them the following. Who is the man who has built a new house but has not yet inhabited it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the war and another man inhabit his house. Who is the man who has planted a vineyard and has not yet harvested it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the war and another man harvest it. Who is the man who has been betrothed to a woman but has yet not taken her to wife? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the war and another man take her. Right? So that's interesting. That's straight from the Torah, from this week's Torah portion. The message is understood as, well, maybe let me not tell you. Let's Rabbi Lew tell you, what does that have to do with Elul? What would this idea of who can go off to war and when they shouldn't go off to war, what does that have to do with Elul? So here's what Rabbi Lew has to say. He says, the idea of all this seems to be that if we leave something incomplete, we fall into the state of mind that the rabbis called treif da'at. Treif da'at, a torn mind. A mind, treif, we know we've heard that word. Treif is the opposite of kosher. Da'at is, your mind, your understanding. So an unkosher mind, treif da'at, a torn mind, a mind pulled in various directions. A person, Rabbi Lew writes, in such a state of mind would be of little use in an army. He would be unable to focus on the task at hand and might even present a danger to his fellow soldiers. Right? It would be, if you're in the front line, you don't want the guy who is getting your back and protecting your life to be thinking about his vineyards and whether or not they have ripened. Rabbi Lew says, during a brief stint as a prison chaplain, I once spoke to a gang member who described what it was like to go to war with his fellow gang members. He spoke glowingly of the sense of total trust you had to have in the person in front of you and the person behind you. Your very life hung on their doing what they were supposed to do. But if they were in a state of treif da'at, if there was unfinished business pulling their awareness away from any moment, they wouldn't be trustworthy. In fact, they would pose a real threat to your survival. See, now this, I'm trying to use this, this is Ain on Lew. So there's Lew, and then I'm going to Rashi it with some Ain here. So it's Ain on Lew. So here he is talking about this treif da'at. Why is this important to me in 2021? Because none of us have been able to finish so many of those things that we started that are in limbo. I have couples that haven't been able to get married for 16 months, b'nai mitzvah that haven't been able to happen, memorial services, gatherings, birthday parties. There's so much that has been left in limbo by our modern predicament and our modern crisis that this has left to maybe an outbreak of treif da'at, of people who have unfinished business going on, all of us do, that is pulling us in a direction that perhaps is taking us away from teshuvah. So let's go on back to Rabbi Lew. We see this very clearly around death. The threefold repetition of the phrase, lest he die, is not insignificant. So in my work as a hospital chaplain, I often witness the irresistible urge people have to tie up loose ends as death approaches, to leave their checkbook balanced, to make their funeral arrangements, to finally confess something that has been on their conscience, to make reconciliation with a friend or a loved one. The urge to complete unfinished business, to tie up loose ends. Can you imagine trying to do all of that in the midst of a pandemic? How much more pronounced what Rabbi Lew is talking about here would be in our world? This urge to complete unfinished business, to tie up loose ends, is one of the strongest forces in nature. And God help anyone who stands in its way. In my experience, this is the single most common source of family conflict around death. The person who is dying asks his family to help him balance his checkbook or purchase a plot in a cemetery, but the members of his family still alive, healthy, and very much caught up in the full-time occupation of denying death don't want to listen. What are you talking about? They tell him. You're not going to die. And that response often provokes unbearable frustration and alienation in the dying, who desperately need to do these things. What is needed is ignored, and they feel more than ever that they are facing death alone. So one more paragraph, and then I'm going to open it here. But like everything else about death, this urge is only an intensification of what happens throughout life. Death is merely a time when what is usually unconscious and invisible becomes conscious and visible. So while we are doing our spiritual inventory, what's called a cheshbon hanefesh during Elul, here's what we should begin with by asking ourselves, what are the loose ends in my life? And there's no doubt a lot of us have a bunch of them. How is my mind torn? Where are the places my mind keeps wanting to go? What is the unfinished business in my life? What have I left undone? When we look out at the world through a torn mind, our experience of the world is torn. So, thoughts, commentary. This is what we do. By the way, 12:30 and no one else has spoken. Well, that's not true. I got a couple of questions. This is almost always very interactive, but I really wanted to begin with a frame to allow us to dig deeper over these coming weeks into our own spiritual practice, to do the practices that Rabbi Lew is asking us to do, and also to sort of see how we feel about it in our world. So does anybody want to comment? Do you have anything to share based upon that? Yeah, Steve.
Yes, talking about confessing before dying. That happened with my father who confessed something that he was always ashamed to tell me about. And I think he was looking for just my recognition or forgiveness or whatever. And I told him, I actually knew about that for the last 20 years, but I never brought it up to you because I figured you'd tell me when you were good and ready to tell me about it. But I think he felt good at the end that I didn't criticize him for that. People do things, and that's just my thinking.
And you were present, Steve. And I'm very,
yeah.
I hear Rabbi Lew, well, people don't want to deal with death. They don't, oh no, I mean, this is, I have examples, very close examples. I can relate to this stuff. They don't want to deal with it. And that just makes things more complicated for the one who is sick. It's just, I mean, the way he describes it here is very beautiful and very poetic in terms of how he discusses that dilemma. Sandy, yeah.
Well, I think that he was also writing in a time before all of the things have come out about, you know, dying with dignity, the compassionate.
Die wisely, die wisely.
Right, and the Atul Gawande's Mortality, his book about in that case, it's healthcare workers, but doctors talking to people who are dying.
And what beautiful Torah, and what beautiful Torah to have right now. Sorry, Sandy.
No.
Yeah, and I really, it makes me sad, Sandy, to think that we haven't been able to sit with our loved ones. I mean, I've buried parents whose children weren't able to say goodbye to them.
I know that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all the palliative care that's taking place. I mean,
very healthy, and so much lessons that we have to get back to applying in our world. Let's go on to Rabbi Lew a little bit. Take this forward. All right, he gives us this questions. Now, Rabbi Lew, as we will see, is a complete poet in terms of his use of illustrations in order to explain. So it's one thing to be told to ask these questions. It's another thing to have a concrete illustration. And I think why Rabbi Lew was such a great rabbi is his sermons and his teachings are full of real world illustrations and examples that we can almost touch and feel and allow us to relate to something which is very esoteric at its heart. So in some cases, we might decide, he writes, that it is just time to let go, to recognize that we are distracted by something that will never be completed. And in some cases, we might decide that the only cure is in fact completion, that there is nothing for it but to tie up that loose end. No way to keep our energy and focus from constantly draining away from the present tense reality of our actual experience, except to finish that which remains unfinished. So he says, life is complex. We are all like jugglers. We're all like jugglers with too many balls in the air by far. Taking a clear look at our lives, we might simply decide that we can't possibly complete all of the unfinished business we have set in motion. Finally, coming home at 9 or 10 at night from a day at work that began at 6 a.m., our mind torn to shreds by the thought of all the phone calls we never had time to return, the tasks we couldn't complete, we might sense in a moment of quiet how much pain all of this has left us in. So this month, when we are taking inventory, one of the things we might decide is how are we going to simplify our lives? How are we in this crazy world of ours going to simplify our lives? We have to do fewer things, Rabbi Lew taught. We have to go to our bosses, or we have to tell ourselves, look, there is just too much on my plate. I'm treiftat, I'm unfocused, I'm torn. The energy of that undedicated house, that unharvested vineyard, that unconsummated marriage, all that energy is tearing my mind, pulling my focus in 100 directions and leaving me not much good for anything. And worst of all, it's causing me to look out through a shattered window. All right, so we see, how can we then focus our mind? How can we find one thing? How can we move all of this clutter. And Rabbi Lew has a couple of ways for us to do that. And what I want to do is go now to a different piece that he wrote, because it's not insignificant. Tomorrow, for the first time in a year and a half, we are going to be gathering for Thursday morning minyan. And this is what Rabbi Lew had to say about minyan and about the daily practice that we could take on during this time period and in our lives. Here's what he writes about the minyan. If you're thinking about coming tomorrow morning, we encourage you. It's at 7:15 tomorrow. We're going to conclude with blowing the shofar, and we want to restart our minyan because it matters.
It's 7 a.m., not 7:15.
It's 7 a.m. Thank you, Sandy.
When did that change?
I don't know.
No, it's
Well, we'll check the calendar. We'll correct that. But
sorry.
that's fine. That's all right. No, that's okay. I'm actually, we'll double check. But either way, if you're there at 7:15, that's great too. If you're there at 7, we're happy to see you. If you're there at 7:30, please do. We'll probably blow the shofar around 8:05. And if you want to come then just to hear the shofar,
It is 7:15, my
come
bad.
then too. That's okay, Sandy. So he writes, our daily minyan is one of the great treasures of our congregation. How sad is that? Oh my God, it makes me so sad. Sorry, I told you I wouldn't focus on the sadness. It provides our members and people all over Northern California with a place to mourn, to observe yard sites, or to simply turn to God in the traditional Jewish way at times in their lives when they feel an urgent need to do so. But the greatest beneficiaries of the minyan are the people who attend every day. Why is this so? According to the Midrash Ein Yaakov, Yehuda HaNasi once asked 3 of his students, Ma haposek hakolel biyoter b'Torah? What is the most inclusive verse in all of the Torah? Ben Zoma chose the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. Ben Azai made another obvious choice. Ve'ahavta le'recha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Then Ben Pazi, a much more obscure rabbi than either Ben Zoma or Ben Azai, chose a verse which was also much more obscure, one of the laws of the temple sacrifice from the book of Numbers. You shall offer up 1 lamb every morning and 1 lamb every night. I agree with Ben Pazi, Yehuda HaNasi said. His students were dumbfounded. How could he prefer this apparently trivial verse to a fundamental statement of principle like the Shema, or a great ethical concept like the commandment to love one's neighbor? The reason, I think, is precisely because they were principles and concepts. The implicit message of this midrash is that it isn't principles or concepts which really count. Rather, it is what we do every day. You shall offer up 1 lamb every morning, 1 lamb every night. If we express our faith in specific concrete deeds by showing up at minyan, if we do so rain or shine on a regular basis, then we are engaged religiously in a way that mere thoughts and good intentions can never engage us. Daily minyan is the modern version of a single lamb our ancestors offered up every morning and every evening. Praying every day, we come to know the full range of human spiritual potential, from transcendent exaltation to stultifying boredom, from the frustration of not quite knowing what we were saying to the joy of being swept up in spiritual energy larger than our own. Praying every day with others, we get a very real sense of how difficult it is to join in a real communion with others, and how wonderful it feels when we finally manage to do so. Praying every day with others, we come to explore that tenuous boundary between self and other, which is always the real locus of the spiritual experience. The holidays are great. They lend the spiritual structure to the cycle of the year. Shabbat is wonderful. Our practice of Judaism depends precipitously when we begin to take Shabbat seriously. But daily minyan represents another quantum leap altogether. And if you're here, maybe you're up for making that quantum leap. As both Ben Pazi and Yehuda HaNasi affirm, it is what we do every day that builds a sense of Jewish spirituality in the warp and woof of our lives. And in the Jewish tradition, daily minyan is the principal medium of daily spirituality. That is why we have mounted a campaign to get more of you to Minyan this year. Not for the Minyan's sake. The Minyan is doing fine and will continue to do fine for the foreseeable future. We are mounting this campaign for your sake. We want you to get a taste of what a daily spiritual practice can do for your soul. Judaism, after all, is a religion of life, and life is what happens every day. It's beautiful. It's just a totally beautiful sentiment. And again, tinged with sadness for our inability to gather and to be able to experience that type of communion and togetherness, knowing how tough it is, all the more so how tough it is in this current environment. Anybody want to give us any thoughts about minyan or about daily practice? And I love how he talks about not just going the way of good thoughts or good speeches or good principles, but it's actually doing the work and showing up. That's the Jewish way. Thoughts, comments? Anybody exposed to Rabbi Lew for the first time have a question? Stuart, yeah.
Hi, Rabbi Ain. Yeah, I have a question. Well, first I have a comment that about the loose ends. That really resonated with me because I don't want to get too personal, but I have a lot of loose ends in my life. I work 2 jobs. I'm contemplating a relocation, which I've been contemplating for quite some time. And so I can really relate to that. But when the video talked about social justice, my question is, social justice means different things to different people. It's been defined as equal rights and equal opportunities for people of all different backgrounds, which I think all reasonable people can agree on. And it's also been defined as things like spreading the wealth around and socialism and communism. And I have no idea where Rabbi Lew falls on that continuum, and I was wondering.
What does Rabbi Lew mean when he says these words? Well, Stuart, I'm pleased to tell you that is my next class, that I have an amazing bit of audio about social justice and what it means to do tikkun olam and how we are supposed to do social justice with kavanah, and what it means to do actual social justice and gimilut chasadim. So my next session next week will be focused in on how do we repair the world? What does social justice mean to Rabbi Lew? And now that he's told you we have to practice, what do we practice out in the world? That's next week's session. I thought about squeezing that in here today, and you would have set me up perfectly for that, but it's too rich, I think, to do in 15 minutes. And I want to stay on track here and talk more about what are the daily practices that we can do this month. So that's okay. Maybe coming to Minyan is going to be hard for some of us. All right, so what do we do if we can't come to Minyan every morning? We don't have an opportunity to do that. So let Rabbi Lew has got other suggestions for us. Focus on one thing, just one thing. It may not be realistic to expect a significant number of people to begin. Is he right about that? Is that unrealistic? Just checking. All right, so back to this, sorry about that. It may not be realistic to expect a significant number of people to suddenly begin showing up at prayer minyans or meditation groups during the month of Elul. Some of us are simply not made to engage in these activities, not in Elul, not ever. Many will never get over finding the daily prayer service tedious and opaque. Many others will always be either frightened to death or bored to tears by the prospect of meditation and the blank wall of self it keeps throwing up against us so relentlessly. So I am pleased to inform you that it is perfectly possible to fulfill the ancient imperative to begin becoming more self-aware during this time without doing these things. Let me recommend a simpler method, and you won't even have to set aside a special time to practice this. You have set aside the time already. Just choose one simple and fundamental aspect of your life and commit yourself to being totally conscious and honest about it for the 30 days of Elul. A world in a grain of sand, as the poet William Blake reminded us. Everything we do is an expression of the entire truth of our lives. It really doesn't make any difference what it is that we choose to focus on, but it ought to be something pretty basic, like eating or sex or money, and for no other reason than that these concerns are likely to arise quite frequently in our lives and to give us a lot of grist for the mill. And I have a piece of audio that I want to play. It's about 6 minutes long of Rabbi Lew doing this in his own life. So let me share it with you. All right. Share. I wonder if I can just share the sound. Let's see if this works. Just nod if you hear.
During the high holidays, during the month of Elul, before the high holidays, I'm always advising people to do all these awareness techniques, mindfulness techniques, because that's what we're supposed to do during Elul. And in addition to meditation and prayer, which are the two main things I advocate, I also tell people be very aware of what you eat, be very aware of how you make love, and be very, very aware of spending money, very, very fundamental things. I always tell people, pick one thing. And so one year, Cheryl said to me, okay, wise guy, I've got one thing for you to pick this year. And that is, I want you to watch how fast you eat. And she did this, not completely out of altruism, but largely because she's sick and tired of sitting across the table from me. Her plate is still full, mine is empty, and I'm eyeing hers covetously. So she said, just watch the speed with which you eat. So I did, and it was just astounding to me what wellsprings of greed and fear I uncovered as I watched myself wolfing down food. And as the month continued, and by the way, I mean, the sad part of the story is that I still eat very, very quickly. But for 1 month, I was very conscious about it. And what I saw so clearly is that if you take this fear and greed that I saw in myself as I was wolfing down this food, and you multiply it by a couple of million people, what you have is a culture that's consuming 80% of the world's resources out of fear and greed, while it represents a much smaller proportion of the population than that. So in other words, this is important stuff we're talking about. It seems like, oh, what difference does it make if I'm aware of what's going on in the present moment of my own experience or not? It makes every difference. It's the only place we can change anything. We really are connected, and the medium of this connection is the person. Yet we struggle desperately against this truth, and this struggle cripples us. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to hold the rest of the world at bay. Energy we could really use. Hatred, anger, projection waste our energy, sap us of our evolutionary power. Why do they have such a persistent hold on us? The sense of brokenness we feel at our core seems to go back as far as we can remember. We are by no means the first culture in the world to intuit it, nor are we the first culture with a yearly ritual of exorcism and atonement for it, a ritual by which we attempted to expunge our brokenness by projecting it on others and then getting rid of them. And in the interest of time, I'll skip 2 pages of brilliantly collected examples of this truth and cut to the chase, which is to suggest that perhaps it's time to stop being bullied around by our own worst impulses. Maybe time to disarm the mechanism by which we cast our dark shadows, the dark reflection of our own brokenness onto others. Perhaps it's time to stop, period, because this is precisely how the disarming begins. We simply stop and look at this mechanism, rushing headlong through our lives, impelled by one unconscious impulse after another. We truly do lead unexamined lives, lives of quiet desperation. We can't see the picture of our lives because as long as we're still moving, we are in the picture. But when we finally stop moving, when we're still, when we sit in meditation, when we pray, when we observe Shabbat, that weekly withdrawal from the ceaseless rush of activity in which we are usually immersed, we step out of the picture for a moment and we begin to see it. The natural shape of our mind begins to come into view. No longer reacting to one impulse after another, we begin to acquire some distance from them, some detachment. We begin to see the mind in all its wild and chaotic disorder, in its addiction to conflict, in its fear of pain and suffering. We begin to see our own complicity in the various conflicts we're engaged in. Now, outside the picture, we don't have to react to the anger or fear. We begin to realize that we don't have to exercise those impulses. We don't have to project them outside of us and onto others. And we don't have to push them back down ourselves either. We don't have to set off a chain of karma in the world or do violence to our own inner world either. We begin to see a third way, a middle way. Shema Yisrael. We just listen to these impulses. We just watch them, conscious for the first time of their ceaseless rise and fall. We just let them rise up and then fall away again with everything else in the universe. And eventually, we ourselves are with everything else in the universe. Eventually, maybe after a lifetime of practice, we begin to see ourselves as part of humanity, reaching out for the next step in its spiritual evolution. Eventually, we begin to outgrow the illusion of separation. But why is it an illusion?
I'm going to stop there. We begin to outgrow the illusion of separation when we pause and when we meditate. Now, the tradition calls this ben mavdil ben kodesh l'chol, to separate from the mundane from the holy. And what Rabbi Lew is pointing us towards is, how do we find a moment to step outside of the flow of the world, everything rushing through, pause, get a little distance from it, and catch ourselves. Well, that's pretty tough today in this world here. Steve.
Yes, Rabbi, that's what I'd argue the pandemic has caused. Just speaking from my own experience before that, I had all these things that I was doing, travel and business and vacations, going to places that I wasn't paying attention to some things in my life. And so when all these other things ended and disappeared, I had to start thinking about things that in myself that I needed to pay attention to, that I hadn't thought about before. And I don't know if anyone else on the call had the same experience.
You're getting a bunch of nods, and I can tell you a few people are on this call came to us because that's exactly how they were feeling. And they reached out to me and to Congregation Beth Shalom, because that's what we're here for. And because we follow the spirit of Rabbi Lew, and we try to create that space of Kedusha so that people can catch themselves. And that is the entire thrust of the month of Elul and the high holidays. Don.
Yeah, I loved when Rabbi Lew used Shema Yisrael as a metaphor for meditation. It was just so beautiful, like, hear, O Israel. And before God is one, and our God is that listen first. And that was just, it feels like a mantra, Shema Yisrael, just alone. Listen, hear me. So I appreciate.
Don, I found it harder. Let me ask you what you think here, because so this is the little routine Don and I have. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to listen. I find like the lack of physical presence makes the listening part so much more challenging, because it's like not everyone can speak at the same time here. You have to wait your turn. You have to like go around Hollywood Squares until you get to speak. it becomes very hard to listen. And then when you get your turn to talk, you better hit it really quickly because people are going to lose interest. So it's really hard to do what Rabbi Lew is saying in our current world and environment. But what I guess Stephen is telling us is like, I found that people in the millennial generation, the generation younger than me, people who thought that they could sort of do it all themselves and do it all DIY, I find a lot of them are now coming to our shul and saying, we want to be a part of a community. We want to be a part of something larger than ourselves. We want to reconnect to traditional wisdom. We've had a break from the past 28, 32 years we've been living. It stopped. And we realized that this little path that we were on perhaps isn't the healthiest one. And so we've been blessed to have lots of younger people who are coming and are finding us, who are here joining us or who are online watching our videos and who are going to be gathering with us in the upcoming weeks and months. So any final thoughts? So as I mentioned, next week, this was really for us to get an overview and to begin the practice of what we want to do this month of Elul. The challenge that Rabbi Lew has given all of us, myself included, is we have to choose one thing. So that's your challenge. You have to choose one thing that you are going to focus your mind on. Are you going to focus on eating fast? What is it that you might focus in on? Marv, you're raising your hand. I haven't heard from you, Marv.
You know, it sounds like we're beating up too much on ourselves.
Good, tell me.
When I'm an old guy.
Did you feel that way about Rabbi Lew in person?
Oh, I used to tell Rabbi Lew that instead of our needing to make tshuva, I think God should make tshuva. I think we have the holiday backwards. But, man's quest for perfection is like utopia. It'll never happen. Now, that doesn't mean we don't want to make the journey. But I think in general, most of us have very good traits. And they've brought us, enabled us to live in a real world. I mean, we do have a real world where we need to make some money, take care of our family, sitting in, I used to say to Rabbi Lew, when you let me bring the New York Times to meditation, I'll be happy to go to meditation. I tend to think the Jewish mind was made for more things than meditation. So I've just I tend to think that a lot of people's characteristics are the way they are. And you look at the plus column and the negative column, and hopefully you've got better column that turns out good than your worst characteristics.
Amen. Marv, your burden is that you have an overactive, over-brilliant mind, which needs a rest from time to time. And
well, now that I'm a lot older, I think God's going to let me rest. and I've also had this concept, who are we kidding? We're going to make tshuva when we die. Isn't that the ultimate return to God?
Well, that certainly is. And the idea of the high holidays and of Yom Kippur in particular, as we will see with Rabbi Lew, this is a dress rehearsal for your funeral. Because when you approach your funeral, this idea of doing teshuva, it could be never more palpable than the story that Steve just shared with us, someone on their deathbed. Ben.
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines as Marvin there. I think the challenge, and it's really hard, is to be aware of yourself without judging yourself. And I know that's sort of a central concept in meditation is non-judgmental awareness, right? And so I think it's possible to pay attention to yourself without beating yourself up, but it is hard.
Well, we do want to do some beating, and we will take our hand and we will pound our chest a little bit, and we don't want to do too much beating, and it's never about beating yourself up, but there is a physical appreciation of the fact.
But we're not the judge.
We have done wrong,
right? But we're not the judge.
No, there's only one judge. That's for sure true. But we can appreciate when we've gone astray. Oh, I have hands. All right. So 2 final comments, Stuart, and then Sandy, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, just briefly, when the rabbi was talking about focusing on one thing, and the Shema was mentioned, it reminded me of a well-known radio personality who related suffering a massive heart attack, and he was in the emergency room, and he kept reciting. He wasn't observant at all, but he kept reciting Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And if you put that as a metaphor for focusing on one thing, it's amazing how people towards the end of their lives start doing that, and how we don't do that when we're healthy.
Amen. And in fact, the bit of audio I played is from an hour-long conversation entirely, Stuart, on the Shema. Okay, one last comment from Sandy Edwards. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say, and I've said it before, that I always used to say every week to Rabbi Lew, you're talking about my life. You know, it was like he was right there. And he says, yeah, we're leading parallel lives. You know, I got it right. And I think that, you know, was one of his.
Do you feel it now listening to him? You feel it after the class?
So
you feel like he's talking right to you?
Yeah. It's so great to hear his voice. Thank you for sharing.
And I think his teaching is very much alive. It's alive in me. It's alive in our community. And the more that we can share it and do it, the healthier our community will be and our world will be. So thank you for joining us. Next week, we are going to get into Tikkun Olam and to social justice. What are the practical activities that we are called to do in repairing our world that the month of Elul and the high holidays should trigger us to getting out and doing? All right, so take care, everybody. And I hope to see you tomorrow morning at 7:15, bright and early for Minyan. All right, so long.
Thank you.
Brooke T.
Thank you.